Hello and welcome to Global Order. My name is Ishan Dhar. One of the key issues that has come up around His Holiness the Dalai Lama's July 2nd statement around his succession is Chinese disinformation, both about the succession plan itself as well as about the state of affairs in Tibet. This disinformation campaign seems to have started before the announcement itself and has continued long after. Alarmingly, some Indian journalists appear to have also played a significant part of such disinformation. Joining me today to look into this further is a Tibetan scholar and erstwhile journalist who spent a significant part of his career combating Chinese disinformation. This is Mr. Yeshi Dawa, who is currently a senior researcher with the 108 Peace Institute and has formerly had stints with Tibet TV and Radio Free Asia. Join us for what is going to undoubtedly be a fascinating conversation. Mr. Dawa, welcome back to Global Order. It's excellent to have you here and definitely excited to discuss the issues at hand with you.
Thank you so much, Ishanji, for having me. I think in the previous talk, I also mentioned that the platform that you have given to me is actually a platform for the Tibetan cause. So I feel very honored to be part of this talk.
It is our pleasure. So, Mr. Dawa, to start off with, even before His Holiness's July 2nd statement, we had seen what I guess you could call a press junket of Indian journalists who went to Tibet around the Kailash Mansarovar. And soon after that, we saw, I guess, the internet flooded with content supporting the Chinese narrative somewhat. Given that we knew that some kind of announcement at least was imminent on July 2nd, what are your thoughts about the timing of this exercise? Was it strategic or something else? We can get into that before we get into the reporting. What do you have to say about the timing?
The visit of Indian journalists to Tibet is actually a part of China's propaganda. So they always believe that it is very important to sell their narrative so that the whole world pays attention to their narrative. So in doing so, they invited a group of Indian journalists. Some of them are a good friend of mine, and I know them personally. So when they visited Tibet, I was constantly checking their Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whether or not they mentioned Xizang instead of Tibet. Luckily, most of them never mentioned Xizang for Tibet, but a journalist, I don't want to name, but that journalist specifically reported about the developments happening in Tibet.
Right.
So if they are actually reporting such kind of information, I think they don't have to go to Tibet because everything is available on China's websites and their mouthpieces, platforms like Global Times and CGTN. Then the very purpose of their visit to Tibet is actually to find the things that are not available on the social media sites.
Right.
And we all know the harsh realities of Tibetans in Tibet. So if they can unearth such information and happenings in Tibet, I think they're also serving their purpose. So ahead of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama's July 2nd statement, it is obvious an attempt from the Chinese government to divert the attention to Tibet and China's narrative of having developments in Tibet, but that never borne any result. As you saw on the very 2nd of July, there were more than 200 journalists from across the world, and they reported that very important statement, and it actually covered the front pages of all the major media outlets in the whole world. So in a very short way, I can say that the China's invitation of Indian journalists to Tibet never served their purpose.
Correct. You were right. Most of the reportage was responsible by the journalists who went. Yet many also, it seemed, wantonly spread Chinese disinformation, most notably on X, formerly Twitter. I couldn't help but notice on one of these tweets you had commented and reminded one of these journalists to quote, not forget the sacrifices made by Indian Jawans in Galwan Valley. And I think you spoke for many of us Indians when you said that. Has there been a concerted attempt by the CCP to actively cultivate Indian journalists? And how successful have they been in that regard?
China has this big advantage. They spent a lot of money on spreading their disinformation across the globe. If you look at the official Facebook page of CGTN, it has more than 125 million followers. Despite its ban in China, but
Right.
I don't know how did they get such followers. We don't know. We have to definitely find it. But as you mentioned rightly, that one of the journalists who visited Tibet, his name is Atul Agarwal. So
Correct.
he belongs to Hindi Khabar news channel. So when he tweeted about his visit to Tibet, he mentioned specifically Xizang for Tibet. So I thought this is not the right way to spread information about Tibet. The very purpose of journalists is to spread the truth about anything that they come across. If he is intentionally spreading China's disinformation and narrative campaign, that is a very sad thing about his professionalism. That's why I just reminded him that when the border incursions happen, and if you look at China's constant claim of Arunachal Pradesh as the part of China, so the very journalist must um, spread the truth behind every narrative. But instead of doing in a truthful way, he's just spreading China's disinformation. So I just reminded him the sacrifices made by the Indian Javans in the Galwan Valley clashes. So we have to tell them the truth about the history and the China's narrative. So if a journalist is not actually aware of what China is doing, then we can't complain about the common citizens who are falling into the type of Chinese
Correct. We're being
disinformation and narrative.
deliberately misled by
Yes.
our own journalists. Now, you brought up the term Xizang, or I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. This term, in fact, actually became, as you said, a very good indicator of who was, I guess, pushing Chinese disinformation and who was avoiding that. What can you tell us about this term? Many of us were perhaps not aware of this term until relatively recently.
Xizang actually refers to the Western treasure, which was named to Tibet in the Chinese language. Now, if you look at this nomenclature and the very moniker Xizang, so they're actually trying to erase the international identity of Tibet because the Tibetan issue was already internationalized by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. Right from 1960s, 70s, 80s, His Holiness traveled across the globe to raise awareness about Tibet. Not only about Tibet, but he has been an ardent follower of Gandhi, who was a very much strong proponent of non-violence. So Tibetan cause was actually based on non-violence path. So that's why, because of such path, Tibet earned international reputation and international recognition. Now, China thought it is necessary to erase the international identity of Tibet. But if you look at the history reminds us that Tibet was already there in the international fora and international platforms. I'll just give you some examples. If you look at the 1934 National Geographic magazine featuring all the independent national flags, Tibet's national flag was there, ahead of what we see Republic of China's national flag and including India's national flag. So that can summarize the independent status of Tibet back then we all were very much familiar with the very popular comic called Tintin. So there was a particular volume about Tintin in Tibet.
Yes, of
So
course.
now I was jokingly telling some of my friends, is the Chinese government going to call in Xizang? So they can't erase all these historical facts. So that's why now they're just trying to erase the very identity of Tibet from international platforms. Now look at how China is influencing its neighbors who are very much dependent on China's economic and its pressure, including Bhutan and Nepal. They already started using Xizang for Tibet. So it is actually very inappropriate to erase the very independent status of Tibet and the very international identity of Tibet. So that's why China is trying to invest a lot in spreading the what we call Xizang for Tibet.
That would certainly seem to be the case. Now, somewhat, I guess, maybe amusingly, alarmingly, as a part of this junket, we saw that there was a official Hindi-speaking Han Chinese host who was seemed to be taking these journalists around. There were videos of them sitting in the courtyard of a monastery where purportedly debate was happening, plucking tomatoes in the field, walking around the markets of Lhasa, whatever. Uh, this individual seems to have an Indian stage name, but we know her called Meera. But I saw from one of the tweets of the Chinese embassy spokesperson, her real name is Zhu Jingjing, which, again, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correct, has over 65,000 followers on Instagram, is openly Chinese state-controlled media, yet this appears to be a very, I guess, peculiar way of getting disinformation or a message across. And I'm told she's not the only one, but this Meera seems to have been all over the place in the coverage that came out. What exactly could you tell us about, I guess, a figure like this, and how can an Indian audience really be aware of these tools that China uses, I suppose, to get our guard down in a way?
Definitely, this is one of the ways how China is trying to influence the common Indian citizens. Because it is very amusing that if a Chinese man or woman speaks fluent Hindi, it really touches the common citizens in India. So that is very obvious, and it because of the differences in the background. But when it comes to the common language, that is Hindi, so it definitely touches millions of Indians. But one thing that the Indians have to keep in mind is it is a stage demonstration from the Chinese government that they're actually trying to tell the Chinese narrative and not the reality happening in Tibet and elsewhere in China. If you really talk to a common citizen in Tibet, if he or she has problem, then they won't allow him or her to speak more than 5 or 10 minutes. I'm sure they will definitely interrupt, and they won't even let the journalist or any TV media platforms to telecast it. So that is very obvious. So if you look at the history and right up to it, like if you go to 2008 protest in Tibet.
Right.
So there was a group of Tibetan monks who were talking to media, international media. So they were crying. They were actually telling the harsh realities happening in Tibet. So if you look at what Meera and the other Chinese staged people who are actually praising China's development in China and Tibet in particular are actually a bait to attract Indians towards China's narrative. So we have to be beware of such initiatives from the Chinese government. On top of that, China is also very clever in investing Indian vloggers. So they invite vloggers to Tibet and mainland China, and they let them to cover stories that they wish to spread across the globe. If a vlogger has more than 2 or 4, 5 million followers, I think it also creates a lot of awareness about China's propaganda, and it actually spreads China's propaganda. So this is part of China's propaganda. So we should not focus on such things. And if you really want to know the truth, it is very important to talk to the Tibetans who don't have such access to media, and then you will know the reality.
Absolutely. So, should there be such a press junket in the future, would you advise your Indian journalist friends to accept such an invitation and go? Second, is it even possible for a foreign journalist to report honestly from today's Tibet? I mean, is that something the Chinese authorities would even allow?
To answer your first question, I think I don't have any authority to advise Indian journalists. It is their prerogative to cover anything they wish to cover. But one thing that I would like to suggest them is it is their job to cover the reality and not the Chinese propaganda. As I said earlier, so if you really want to cover Chinese propaganda, you actually don't have to go there. So everything is available on social media platforms. If you look at Chinese social media platforms, it is available on every social media platforms. So what you have to do is to unearth the realities. And just one example, I'll give you one example. I think ahead of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama's 90th birthday, a BBC journalist visited a monastery in Tibet, and she actually unearthed the realities happening in Tibet. Some of the monks spoke to her, and they really decried over the over the harsh policies implemented in Tibet. So that is the job of a journalist, and it actually went viral across the world. And that is also something new after a long time. So if they can do such a job, I think the international community will appreciate them. And if they fall in the trap of Chinese propaganda and disinformation, then I wouldn't call them an authentic journalist, really. So I know the power of money. So we all need money for better livelihood. But if we really do justice to our profession, not just our profession, but the audience that we cater something that they would like to hear, if we are just giving them something is not truthful and propaganda, then I think we are not doing the right job. And to answer your second question, I think the a group of Indian journalists who went to Tibet also covered Kailash Yatra. So, and I always tell my Indian friends, and I tell them that China has already snatched Mount Kailash from Tibet. Now, is the Dalai Lama institution next in the line? Because whenever border incursions happen, whenever the situation is not in favor of China, then they would just stop Kailash Yatra. But if you look at before 1950s, Indians didn't have to seek permission from Chinese government. and they can visit there freely, and they can do worship and everything. But now the situation is otherwise, and they have to seek permission, and it is also under a very heavy restriction. So, so that's why the Chinese government is uh, actually trying to tell the Indians that they have resumed Kailash Yatra, and Indians are enjoying in Tibet, and they're doing best in Tibet. So this is also one part of the propaganda. But I think most of the Indian journalists who went there to cover, they did not mention Xizang for Tibet, except a journalist, which I mentioned earlier.
Fortunately, it was just one. Now, coming to the succession plan itself, which I guess was revealed to some degree on July 2nd, predictably, the CCP reacted with outrage and indignation. They've been indicating their desire to approve His Holiness's successor for a long time now. Paradoxes and irony notwithstanding, of course, the atheist party in government. We even had the Chinese ambassador here tweeting about golden urns and lots and other things in that zip code. But interestingly, the Chinese spokesperson in Delhi was lashing out at the Indian media and strategic community for having conversations like this one, claimed that His Holiness's forthcoming succession is an internal affair of China. She even went on to add that Tibet related issues were a thorn in India's side and a burden. So, what are your thoughts on these assertions? And do you think that this indicates a sense of insecurity already, that they're aware of the fact that this institution, by all likelihood, can never fall into their hands?
Shanji, China's claim having a right to choose the next Dalai Lama is actually what we call all hat, no cattle. Because if you look at the history, I just want to make it very clear here. China actually doesn't like the current Dalai Lama, and they call him quote unquote separatist, monk in wolves sheep clothing. So they actually labeled all the possible bad things to the current Dalai Lama, but they're very much worried about the 15th Dalai Lama. So this very contradiction and a paradox actually speaks a lot about China's intention towards the 15th Dalai Lama. Now, I'll just try to highlight some of China's intention towards the 14th Dalai Lama. So back in 1950s, when China invaded Tibet, it was His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama's eldest brother, Taktse Rinpoche, who was sent to Lhasa and to persuade His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama to accept China's rule. If His Holiness doesn't accept it, then the Taktse Rinpoche were told to assassinate His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. So can you imagine? This is how China looks at His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. And on the 10th of March 1959, when China invited His Holiness the Dalai Lama to a theatrical show, the Brigadier Fu, a Chinese military Brigadier Fu, told His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama's bodyguard to not bring any bodyguard with His Holiness. So that was actually a plan to capture His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And the third thing, when His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama fled Tibet and escaped into India, the Mao Zedong, when Mao Zedong was informed about His Holiness the Dalai Lama's escape, he just said that we have lost. So today, China claims that China has the right to choose the next Dalai Lama is actually a continuation of Mao's failure of capturing His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So, and we don't have to talk about the atheist nature of China, and they don't believe in religion. And despite this irony, and China still claims that they have the right to choose the next Dalai Lama, but it is all about power. And I'm sure it is actually all about political power. But I'm sure they must have already realized that I once said it that even if we combine all the leaders of China, including Xi Jinping, right from Mao Zedong, if we put them together, still they couldn't overshadow the charismatic leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Tibet and international at international platforms. So they thought now they could do something with the 15th Dalai Lama, but that is not going to happen because we all know that the 15th Dalai Lama, if chosen by the Chinese government, is going to be a product of Make in China. So we all know that Make in China products don't last long.
Correct. And we've heard a lot about this Golden Urn, which purportedly dates back to the Manchu period. Now, there seems to be a lot of debate about what this is. If you could briefly tell us, what is this Golden Urn? Is there a historical precedent when it comes to its use? And I noticed on a television show when you were talking about the tragedy of the 11th Panchen Lama, we all know what happened. But even when the Chinese appointee was chosen using the urn, you cited Arjia Rinpoche, who was a very senior Tibetan Lama who had escaped from China, who had revealed the inside story of how that process went about. If you could tell us in some detail what had happened there, that would, I think, be quite instructive.
Definitely, as you mentioned about the Golden Urn narrative of the Chinese government, I think one thing that is very clear about China's narrative about the 15th Dalai Lama is that they don't have any other narrative than the Golden Urn narrative. So they would always say in their press conference that they have the right to choose the next Dalai Lama, and that will be done through what we call Golden Urn system. But it has to go back to 1793 when the Manchu Emperor invented this very system. But one thing that we have to keep in mind is the Manchu Emperor back then was a devout Buddhist, not like today's Chinese leadership. They all are actually atheists and they don't believe in religion. So now, and the very purpose of Golden Urn was to actually choose the reincarnation if there's a confusion between the two candidates. Now, when there's a confusion between two candidates, right, then it is the Golden Urn imposed by the Manchu Emperor will have the role to play. But in most of the cases, in the reincarnation of the highly learned practitioners and spiritual masters, including His Holiness the Dalai Lamas and the Panchen Lamas, we actually didn't have to use the Golden Urn system because the way we choose our reincarnation is actually very sophisticated and is very much in line with the spiritual matter. Because if you want to really know about the reincarnation, at least one has to believe in the life after birth, life after death.
Right.
So China never accepts it. So let alone talking about the spiritual matters of Tibetan Buddhism. So as you said about the Arjia Rinpoche, he was actually involved in the reincarnation of the 11th Panchen Lama of Chinese government.
Right.
So when they told Arjia Rinpoche to proceed to a Golden Urn ceremony in Lhasa, Arjia Rinpoche was actually there with some other highly reputed Tibetan lamas. So when they started choosing the next 11th Panchen Lama, so the Phumi Rinpoche was there. So he chose one lot from the Golden Urn. And later, Arjia Rinpoche was told by the Ye Xiaowen, who was then the Bureau of Religious Affairs, and it is now called as State Administrations for Religious Affairs. So in short, we can call it SARA, S-A-R-A, right?
Right.
So they also stipulated Order number 5 to curb the reincarnations of all the religious leaders in Tibet. So when it told Arjia Rinpoche that they actually chose the candidate that they would like to have by putting cotton in the pouches of the ivory lot, so that one of them definitely would look little higher than the rest, right? Then the Phomi Rinpoche chose the higher one, and that is exactly what they got, the 11th Panchen Lama, Gensen Nobu. So this is that.
Whose parents, I think, unsurprisingly, were members of the Chinese Communist Party,
Yes,
if
yes.
I'm not wrong. Yes.
So now we can clearly see how corrupt the Golden Urn system is. It can be manipulated. So China now has this plan of manipulating the Golden Urn system and choosing the candidate they would like to have in case of the 15th Dalai Lama. So it is quite important to tell the audience how corrupt the Golden Urn system is and how China is going to manipulate it. So that scenario actually summarizes the reason behind the Golden Urn system in choosing the next Dalai Lama. So China thinks that they will succeed in this system, but it is not going to be so easy for them.
Yet, it seems like the Chinese are, of course, hell-bent on picking their own candidate, regardless of what may transpire outside India. Yet, if the case of Gyaltsen Norbu, the 11th Panchen Lama, can be used as precedent or as an example, would a Chinese-appointed 15th Dalai Lama really be of any utility to the Chinese agenda in Tibet? Because by all indicators, it seems that the Tibetans will never accept a Chinese appointee. So, what are your thoughts on this matter?
So if you look at the 11th Panchen Lama appointed by the Chinese government, it is quite a sad reality because Tibetans are being paid to receive his blessings in Tibet. So, and the very purpose of the reincarnation is to continue the works done by the predecessor. Now, if you look at the 10th Panchen Lama, he was imprisoned by the Chinese government for 14 years, and he worked tirelessly for the cause of Tibet. And because of his leadership, uh, I think the Tibetan culture and language survived in Tibet. Now, we can clearly see how the current 11th Panchen Lama appointed by the Chinese government is working in Tibet. So as of now, he had four meetings with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. One happened before Xi becoming the president, but three happened during the Xi's presidency. So the first meeting was actually focused on the Panchen Lama appointed by the Chinese government becoming a patriotic leader for the Chinese government. Then the second and third were focused on the synthesization of Tibetan Buddhism into Chinese characteristics. And the third one was actually focused on promoting national unity in Tibet. So now it is clearly understandable that the 11th Panchen Lama appointed by the Chinese government is a real puppet for the Chinese government. So in other way, it is actually not serving the interests of the Tibetan Buddhism, and let alone talking about the Tibetan cause back in Tibet. So if China succeeds in appointing the 15th Dalai Lama, we will have two Dalai Lamas, two Dalai Lamas in future. But I'm sure the whole world will not accept China's appointed Dalai Lama. And we don't have to talk about Tibetans in Tibet, but I'm sure the Chinese government will use all the possible ways to pressurize and influence the Tibetans in Tibet to revere their appointed Dalai Lama. But there are lots of ramifications that will unfold. So as per research, I think there are more than 300 Buddhist followers around the world. I'm sure there are more, but so it also affects all the Buddhist followers in the whole world. Because right now, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama is considered as the supreme leader in the Buddhism across the world. Now, I'm sure the Chinese Buddhists may not have this privilege to receive teachings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and his advices on the Buddhism in general. But if you look at the free countries where they practice Buddhism, they all revere His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama a lot, and their respect to the current Dalai Lama is something beyond our imagination. And recently, I also had the privilege of attending the International Buddhist Confederation's celebration of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama's 90th birthday in New Delhi. So there were more than 500 delegates from 20 plus countries in the world. So I also met them individually. So when I talk about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, they have full devotion in the current Dalai Lama, but it is also related to their country's relations with the China. So they don't have the freedom to express it openly, right? But I'm sure China will just utilize it for the purpose of political benefits, not for the bigger purpose, that is to spread. Not when I say spread, actually, I'm not talking about propagating it, but the very teachings of the Buddha.
And actually, on that note, I think in the last few years, there have also been attempts to, I suppose, push their appointed Panchen Lama into other Buddhist countries. I believe he has been to Thailand, for example. How successful have they been in this regard? Sort of using him as a cultural tool, I suppose.
I think as of now, the Chinese government has not been able to utilize the 11th Panchen Lama appointed by
Great.
themselves. As you rightly said, that he visited some of the neighboring countries, particularly the Buddhist countries, to teach Buddhism there. So the very purpose that parallels his visit is to promote China's propaganda. So, and to tell them in advance that he is the sole authority to choose the next Dalai Lama. Because if you look at the history, right, the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama actually choose each other's reincarnation.
Great.
So at one time in future, China will definitely use the 11th Panchen Lama appointed by themselves when it comes to choosing the next Dalai Lama. So he will just come up and say that he is going to choose the next Dalai Lama. And it is also related to the historical evidences. So I'm sure this is one, I think, utility that the 11th Panchen Lama appointed by the Chinese government produces. But the rest are actually not so effective because his visits does not guarantee the full devotion from the Buddhist followers
Great.
in the Chinese government and the Panchen Lama appointed by the Chinese government.
I think that would be a good note to conclude this conversation. Mr. Dawa, thank you very much for your time. That was most insightful.
It is my pleasure. So before I end, I think I would like to remind our audience, particularly the Indian audience. So India has been very, very much grateful for the cause of Tibet. I'm sure there are no other countries who have done so much for the cause of Tibet than India. So His Holiness rightly says that Indians are our guru and we are their chelas. So one message that I would like to remind all the Indian brothers and sisters is, if the chelas are in problem, it is the duty of guru to look after the chelas. And one very important chela who will have to face difficulties in future is His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. So Indians must be ready to cope up this challenge, particularly the youth aged between 30 to 35. Because after 30 years, they will be at the Raisina Hill, and some of them will be the next Foreign Minister of India, and they will have to deal with the issue of Tibet. And I'm sure right now they are very much focused on their career, but at some point, I'm sure they will have to deal with the issue of Tibet. So it is high time to pay heed to the issue of Tibet so that it will help them in the future. Thank you so much, Ishanji. My pleasure.
Mr. Dawa, I'm sure your message will strike a chord. Thank you very much.
Thank you.